Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 214 and it's titled Islands Walked. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So this week, our random card is completely random, not one of our suggested cards, and it is River Bear. And River Bear is simply a 3 and a green, 4 mana for a 3/3 bear, and it has Island Walk. So there are a lot of different things that you can do with this creature because obviously it's a bear. There's a lot of stuff that cares about bears. It has Island Walk, which is kind of unique. Plus, it's just a green creature, and green is obviously very good at dealing with creatures. But to pick the most unique aspect of it, I did decide to go with Island Walk. And so we are building around this as kind of an Island Walk themed deck. And if that's the case, then I could think of at least one commander that is perfect for this deck. So the commander that we chose this week is Xolatoyac the Smiling Flood. And that is 4 green-blue for a 6/6 legendary creature Salamander Serpent. Whenever it enters or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. That land is an island in addition to its other types for as long as it has a flood counter on it. And at the beginning of your end step, untap each permanent you control with a counter on it. So essentially, we can then put the flood counter on one of our forests, and then we can untap it at the end of turn. It now taps for a green and a blue. But we're also able to put it on our opponent's things because it doesn't have to be a land we control. And if we're putting a flood counter on a land that our opponents control, it's turning it into an island while not shutting off their colors. So it's not necessarily stacks or shutting them out of the game, but it gives us the way to make sure everyone has an island, even if our opponents aren't playing blue. And then our River Bear with its Island Walk is guaranteed unblockable on any opponent. So that is the main synergy of what we're building around. But of course, we also got to talk about some of the themes that are in the deck. Now, we've kind of already mentioned one, which is of course Island Walk. Having creatures with Island Walk is going to be the main focus of our strategy, being able to turn our opponent's lands into islands and then swing in with what are now essentially unblockable creatures. We have everything from the massive Island Walk creatures all the way down to the small ones like Gray-Scaled Gharial, which is just 1 blue mana for a 1/1 crocodile, and it has Island Walk. So being able to have creatures that can come down early and start swinging in early, and then eventually, once they become fully unblockable, or maybe if we get lucky and our opponents have islands naturally, then we can keep doing damage as the game progresses. Our next theme is going to be turning our opponent's lands into islands, because we do have to make sure that we're able to get through with our Island Walk creatures. And yes, we have our commander, but Xolatoyac is 6 mana, so it's not exactly an early game way to get those islands into play. One of the early game ways that we can get the islands into play, though, is with Quicksilver Fountain. And Quicksilver Fountain is 3 mana for an artifact. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player puts a flood counter on target non-island land they control. That land is an island for as long as it has a flood counter on it. And at the end of turn, if lands in play, all lands, not just our lands or our opponents, if they all are islands, then we remove all flood counters from them. The important thing to note about Quicksilver Fountain is that it puts flood counters on things just like Xolatoyac does, but they do something different. Xolatoyac turns things into islands, but they keep their normal land types. So putting it onto a forest means it taps for green and a blue. Quicksilver Fountain's flood counters turn them just into islands. It removes all other land types from them. So if our opponents are playing, say, a 5-color deck, and they've got all of these lands that tap for multiple colors, we can start turning them into islands and essentially start to lock them out of their colors. And while they get to choose the land that they put the counters on, it does play very similar to a stacks piece. It does shut people out of the game because it can cut them off from colors they need. So if you're not a fan of that style of gameplay, then Quicksilver Fountain is one of the few ways to permanently turn something into an island and remove all of its other types. So you could remove that aspect of it. Xolatoyac, not exactly a stacks piece, but still relevant to what we're trying to do. And then, last but not least, our final theme of the deck is going to be Islands Matter. Because we are so focused on giving everyone at the table islands, we may as well also be focused on giving ourselves islands because we can untap them with Xolatoyac. So for example, we have payoff effects like Cherix the Raging Isle, which is 2 blue for a 0/17 legendary creature Leviathan Crab. Spells your opponents cast that target Cherix cost 2 more to cast, and you can pay 3, and it gets +X -X until the end of turn, where X is the number of islands you control. Now, obviously, if you have 17 or more islands, you're not going to want to activate this because it will kill Cherix. But if we have 16 islands, we can attack. If someone blocks, that's fine. If they don't block, that's also fine, because we can pay 3 mana to essentially give Cherix 16 power and then only 1 toughness, which is quite the change from a 0/17. And it's definitely one of those cards that rewards us for having more islands, and that is really what this deck is all about. So those are all of our themes for this week. And the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some key cards. And these are going to be cards that really synergize with what our deck is trying to do, and in some cases are win conditions or value pieces, but most of the time these are the cards we want to see the most. So the first card I want to talk about is the Flood of Mars. And this is a card that when I put it in the deck, I didn't think too much of it. I figured, yeah, it's a great way to put flood counters on stuff. We might use it. And then after a couple of games and playtesting, this card really is an MVP in the deck. It is 2 blue for a 3/3 alien zombie horror. It has Islandwalk, and water always wins. Whenever the Flood of Mars attacks, put a flood counter on another target creature or land. If it's a creature, it becomes a copy of the Flood of Mars. If it's a land, it becomes an island in addition to its other types. So again, when I first put this in, I saw this as having Islandwalk, which is great, and we can turn lands into islands, which is also great. But I didn't realize just how powerful it was to put those flood counters on creatures, because that essentially removes the creature from play. It turns it into a Flood of Mars, which is then turning other things into islands, turning other things into Floods of Mars. So this is quite a good way to remove an opponent's commander, because they won't be able to put the commander back into the command zone. It has to stay in play as a Flood of Mars. It's a great way to remove indestructible creatures or creatures that have some sort of evasion or some massive game-winning effect, because now it's just a 3/3 with Islandwalk that turns itself and other things into Floods of Mars. This is also incredibly relevant because now we are attacking with this creature, we're turning things into islands, we're giving our opponents Floods of Mars, and they have Islandwalk. So even if our opponents want to remove their creatures, and they're attacking into opponents that maybe normally would not have islands, we should hopefully have turned their lands into islands at this point, making the Flood of Mars unblockable and very difficult for our opponents to get rid of them if that's what they want to do. So I really do think the Flood of Mars is an MVP of the deck, and I really can't hype it up enough for what we want to be doing. And all of that to be said, I didn't think it was going to be much when we first put it in, so it really shows how good it is in a game, even if it doesn't look that great on the surface. Moving on to our next key card. This one is going to be Eluge the Shoreless Sea, and this is 1 blue for a star legendary creature elemental fish, and its power and toughness are equal to the number of islands we control. So ideally, if it's 4 mana, we probably have 4 islands in play. We cast it, it's a 4/4, pretty solid. But it grows as the game goes on, which obviously is much better. And whenever it enters or attacks, put a flood counter on target land. It's an island in addition to its other types for as long as it has a flood counter on it, which obviously, very good. We want to put that on stuff. But This one specifically rewards us for putting that flood counter on our things, because it also says the first instant or sorcery spell you cast each turn costs a blue or 1 generic mana less to cast for each land you control with a flood counter on it. We have a ton of ways to put flood counters on our lands, and we'll be untapping them with Xolatoyac, so being able to get a luge down means we can essentially cast almost any instant or sorcery in our entire deck for free. And obviously, if it's a green instant or sorcery, we still have to pay the green cost. That is the downside to flood counters and islands in a Simic deck. But it's such a small downside when even casting a 3 mana Cultivate, for example, you're still casting it for just a single green. So Eluge really pulls its own weight and allows us to really kind of control the pace of the game, because we can cast our instants and sorceries at a much cheaper rate than our opponents and just kind of grow our value while everyone else is maybe ramping or putting creatures into play. We get to kind of just do both. But that is only keycard number 2, so we're going to move on to keycard number 3, which is Toski, Bearer of Secrets. And this is another card that, yes, I know is kind of a generic value card, but considering most of our creatures are going to be unblockable most of the time, it's very powerful in our deck. Because Toski is 3 and a green for a 1/1 legendary creature squirrel. This spell can't be countered, it's indestructible, it attacks each combat if able, and whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. So being able to have a board of unblockable creatures means that whenever we hit an opponent, we're going to be drawing a card for each creature that deals damage. That puts us in a situation where if we're attacking with even just 3-4 creatures, we're drawing 3 or 4 cards a turn. That then turns into possibly more ramp, more flood counters, more creatures, and we can slowly snowball out of control, provided our opponents have no way to deal with what we're doing. And considering we're in blue, that does mean we have access to things like counter spells, we have removal, we've got great ways to protect our board. So this is a phenomenal way to just slowly run away with the game in a way that our opponents are going to be unable to interact with. Those, though, are all of our key cards for this week, and the next thing we're going to have to do is take a look at some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize really well with each other, and in some cases can be win conditions, value engines, or more likely are just fun cards that I felt like they should be highlighted in some capacity. So the first cool interaction we're going to talk about is going to be between Cold-Eyed Selkie and Beastmaster Ascension. So Cold-Eyed Selkie, a phenomenal Islandwalk creature. It's 1 and then a hybrid green-blue for a 1/1 Merfolk Rogue. It has Islandwalk, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may draw that many cards. Because it's naturally a 1/1, whenever it hits an opponent, we're going to draw 1 card, but because it has Islandwalk, we can almost always guarantee that it will be able to get in. However, we can also bump up its power and therefore draw more cards. And one of the best ways we can do that is with Beastmaster Ascension, which is 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, you may put a quest counter on Beastmaster Ascension, and as long as it has 7 or more counters on it, creatures you control get +5/+5. Being able to turn the Cold-Eyed Selkie into a 6/6 means that when it hits, it's not only doing 6 damage, but we are now drawing 6 cards. That gives us a lot more creatures that we can dump onto the board. It gives us protection spells, gives us ramp spells, and Beastmaster Ascension is actually quite easy to turn on in this deck because we can keep attacking, we can keep putting pressure on our opponents. But unfortunately, a lot of our Islandwalk creatures do tend to be pretty small. We tend to usually max out at like 3 mana unless we get to some very expensive cards in terms of mana cost. So Beastmaster Ascension also helps us keep that pressure on our opponents and gives us a win condition outside of just slowly ticking down their life totals with 1/1s, 2/2s, and 3/3s. Moving on to our next cool interaction. This one is going to be Stormtide Leviathan and Carpet of Flowers. So Stormtide Leviathan, one of the best cards in this entire deck. It is 5 blue, so 8 total mana for an 8/8 Leviathan. It has Islandwalk, All lands are islands in addition to their other types, and creatures without flying or island walk cannot attack. So turning all lands into islands, perfect. That's what we want to do. That gives all of our island walk creatures the ability to just keep swinging. Then, creatures without flying or island walk can't attack is really going to hinder most other decks at the table, but it shouldn't affect us at all. We should still be able to keep attacking, and if we can play our cards right, this could be a great way for us to essentially just win the game because our opponents can never really attack us. The other thing that we want to be doing once we've turned all lands into islands is comparing that with Carpet of Flowers, because Carpet of Flowers is 1 green mana for an enchantment. At the beginning of each of your main phases, if you haven't added mana with this ability this turn, you may add X mana of any one color, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. Since all lands are islands, all of our opponent's lands are now islands. So if someone has, say, 10 lands, they control 10 islands, Carpet of Flowers will trigger, we will make 10 mana in our first main phase, so that gives us a massive ramp spell that we're able to essentially dump our entire hand, we can cast our commander, we can do whatever else we need to do, because no matter what, we're always going to have access to what we need, and it's always going to be a great way to keep reusing some of our spells, because it's going to keep giving us that mana every single turn while we are just dumping our hand into play, maybe drawing more cards, doing more damage, and hopefully, since we still have the Leviathan, not really taking damage in return. So it's very likely that if you can get both of these cards in play at the same time, that you probably just win the game because you're just going to absolutely run away with the game. That, though, is the end of our cool interaction. So the last piece of this deck tech is to take a look at the price of the deck. And this week, our total deck price came in at $67.75, with our most expensive card being Thada Adel Acquisitor at a massive $10.60. And while I do really like Thada Adel, she is very expensive, so trimming her down could cut the deck to below 60, which is much more manageable. However, she is very good in this deck because of her Island Walk ability. Overall, though, she is 1 blue for a 2/2 Merfolk Rogue, of course, Island Walk, and whenever she deals combat damage to a player, we search that player's library for an artifact card and exile it, then that player shuffles their library, and until end of turn, you may play that card. This is a great ramp piece, even though it doesn't necessarily look like ramp, because most people are probably playing artifact, maybe lands, artifact rocks, things that they're able to play that are going to get them more mana. So we could steal someone's Soul Ring, we can steal someone's Arcane Signet, and if we really need to, there's also a chance that there's people playing artifacts that have removal or card draw on them that we can take as well, and kind of use this as a toolbox card that can just get whatever we need whenever we need it. Again, that being said, while I do think that she deserves to be in the deck, she is still $10, so if you do need to trim on the budget, she's probably the card to cut. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little outside of our budget range, I do have a suggestion for you there as well. And this week, I would recommend putting in Quilled Great Worm and taking out Tidal Warrior. Now, I know Quilled Great Worm is only $5.48, so it's technically not outside of our budget limit. But if we're being perfectly honest, it's one of those cards that it just feels like it should fit. And at the time when I was building the deck, foundations hadn't really come down in price, so this was a much more expensive card originally, which is why it didn't make the cut. Now, a little bit more manageable, but still worth mentioning. Mainly because Quilled Great Worm is 4 green for a 7/7 worm. It's got trample. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, put that many +1/+1 counters on it, and you may cast this card from your graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying its other costs. So a couple of key things to remember about Quilled Great Worm and why I think it's such a good include is that Xolatoyac untaps our permanents with counters on them at the end of our turn. Putting counters on of our creatures means we can attack and essentially have vigilance because then they can untap and still block. But this is also kind of an anthem effect that lets us speed up our ability to win the game. Because if we attack someone with a 1/1 Islandwalk creature, we'd only be doing 1 damage a turn. But with Quilled Greatworm, we attack for 1, we put 1 counter on that creature. Next turn we attack for 2, put 2 counters, then 4, 8, 16. This is one of the best ways for us to just really snowball out of control and put ourselves in a winning position. Not necessarily out of nowhere because our opponents will see it coming, but it puts us in a position to win in a much faster way than our deck could probably do otherwise. However, though, if you are putting a card into the deck, you obviously have to take a card out. And like I mentioned earlier, the card I would recommend taking out is Tidal Warrior, which is 1 blue mana for a 1/1 Merfolk Warrior, and it can tap and target land becomes an island until the end of turn. Now, originally this was in here to make sure we could always trigger our Island Walk, but after a little bit of playtesting and making sure the deck can actually function, it's actually pretty irrelevant to the overall theme of the deck, because with our flood counters, we can permanently turn things into islands, so it's very unlikely that we actually need the Tidal Warrior to do what it needs to do at any given time. And if we're not doing that, then it's just a 1/1, it has no other abilities, it itself doesn't even have Island Walk, so it really just felt like a dud most of the time. And that's not to say that it's always going to be useless, because I'm sure there's situations where it's great, but it just doesn't feel as good as Quilled Greatworm, in my opinion. That, though, brings us to the end of our deck tech for this week. And before we get into a game, because obviously we got to see how this deck performs in action, before we get to that, I want to take a second to highlight some of the ways that you can help support the channel, and of course shout out all of our patrons and channel members, and of course, just a huge thank you to everyone who watches the videos, a huge thank you to everyone who's liking the videos, subscribing to the channel, commenting on the videos. I really do enjoy interacting with everybody and seeing what people think about the decks and the games. It's a ton of fun and one of the main reasons I enjoy doing this. So thank you all so much. But of course, a shout out has to go out to our patrons and channel members, which, if you would like to join them, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member, which is linked in the description of the video. But a thank you to all of our patrons and channel members goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, the Oak Monster, and 2Ku Spooner. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support. And without any further ado, let's check out our opponents and see how we're going to do in a game. So this week, our Island Walking is going to be running up against Nissa World Soul Speaker, being played by Bilal, Bjorna Nightfall Alchemist, and Elmar Ulvenwald Informant, being played by Jason, and Arvad the Cursed, being played by Doodle. So starting off with Nissa and Bilal's deck, this is kind of just a mono-green stompy deck. One of the main things that he wants to do is obviously make landfall, so that way he can get more energy, and then he wants to use that energy instead of his mana to cast his spells. So it's like a mono-green ramp and mono-green stompy deck, but it does kind of allow him to lean more into the landfall and use that as a way to both ramp into his creatures while also casting some for free, which I think is a super cool and unique little space to build around for mono green. And he normally, Bilal will do this thing where he will set his decks out on the table and ask someone, typically me, to pick the deck that he's going to play. And I specifically did ask to play against Nissa World Soul Speaker, so I guess in the end, if we wind up losing to this deck, then you can blame me, that's my fault, but I'm excited for it. I think this deck is super sweet, and I'm very much excited to play against it. Next up, Jason's Bjorna and Elmar deck. This is kind of a junk token style of deck, so he wants to play things that net him clues and treasures and food, and wants to then use those things to sacrifice to Bjorna, which he can then cast more spells, and then Elmar can untap Bjorna. And I believe that these two are also maybe better known as the Stranger Things commanders. I want to say that they are Max and Lucas. I don't 100% know for sure, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's what they are. So if you recognize the text boxes but not the names or the art, that might be where you've seen them. And Jason, very good when it comes to playing specifically blue decks, but specifically blue decks that also deal with things like tokens and ramp and other kinds of things. So I am very concerned about this deck. I would probably say this is the deck I'm the most concerned about, just because I know how powerful artifacts are, and Bjorna being able to goad things can really put us in a tricky position, because we want to be attacking and our goal is to eventually have some massive creatures. So if he can kind of use us as a sword, then we might struggle a bit at the end. And then last but not least, we have Doodle playing his Arvad the Cursed deck. This is a legendary matters style of deck. He wants to play a bunch of Orzhov legends, give them +2/+2, and then find ways to kind of make use of Orzhov's ability to gain life and reanimate creatures and just kind of outvalue the rest of the table. And there's been a ton of legends printed lately in the last couple of years, so I do think that this deck has gotten a lot of support, and I'm very interested to see what he can do, because I have no doubt that there's some very vague or unique legends that I've probably never heard of that are absolute slam dunks in this deck. So I'm very excited to see what Doodle's cooked up this week. But overall, let me know what you think. If there's any deck that you think is going to win, make sure you get your predictions in. I love seeing what people think is going to happen in the game or who's going to walk out the winner. So let me know down in the comments. Don't forget, as always, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. But otherwise, let's jump into this game, see how we do, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by Bilal, Jason, and then Doodle. On my first turn, I play an island and cast Rashadan Dockhand, which has Islandwalk and can tap to tap target land. Bilal plays a forest and casts Elvish Mystic. Jason plays a Temple of Epiphany, scrying 1. Doodle plays a swamp. I play a Desert of the Indomitable. Bilal plays a forest and casts Somber Walled Sage. Jason plays a Mossfire Valley and casts Mindstone. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Talisman of Hierarchy. I play an island and cast Cultivate, searching my library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into my hand. Bilal casts his commander, Nissa World Soul Speaker, getting 2 energy whenever a land enters under his control, and letting him pay 8 energy rather than the mana cost of permanent spells he casts. Then he plays a forest, getting 2 energy, and cast Architect of the Untamed, getting an energy whenever a land enters under his control, and letting him pay 8 energy to make a 6/6 beast token. Jason casts his commander Elmar Ulvenwald Informant, letting him untap target creature and investigate whenever he casts his second spell each turn. Since Elmar has haste, he attacks Doodle for 3, and in his second main phase, plays a Temple of Abandon, scrying 1. Doodle plays a Plains and casts Lauren of the Third Path, destroying Jason's Mind Stone when she enters, and she can also tap to let Doodle and another target player each draw a card. I play an island, cast Rampant Growth, searching my library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. Then I cast Tempest Djinn, which has power equal to the number of islands I control, which is currently 5. Bilal plays a forest, getting 3 energy, and casts Llanowar Elves. Jason plays a Thornwood Falls, gaining a life, attacks Doodle with Elmar for 3, but Doodle blocks it with Lauren, killing both creatures and taking no damage. Then, in his second main phase, Jason cast Blasphemous Act, doing 13 damage to each creature, completely wiping the board. Doodle plays a Snowfield Sinkhole and casts Teshar Ancestor's Apostle, returning a creature with mana value 3 or less from his graveyard to the battlefield whenever he casts a historic spell. I play a forest and cast Inkfathom Divers, which has Islandwalk, and when it enters, I look at the top 4 cards of my library, putting them back in any order. Bilal casts a Birds of Paradise. Jason plays an island and casts his other commander, Bjorna Nightfall Alchemist, which can tap to sacrifice an artifact, deal 1 damage to target creature, and goad that creature. Then he casts Breaches the Blastmaker, letting him sacrifice an artifact when he casts his second spell each turn, and if he does, he flips a coin, copying that spell if he wins, or doing damage equal to any target equal to the spell's mana value if he loses. Doodle plays a Myriad Landscape and casts his commander, Arvad the Cursed, giving his other legendary creatures +2/+2. This also triggers Teshar, returning Lauren from his graveyard to the battlefield. Then he attacks Jason for 4 with Teshar. I cast my commander, Xolatoyac the Smiling Flood, putting a flood counter on target land when it enters or attacks, turning that land into an island in addition to its other types, and untapping all permanents I control with counters on them in my end step. With this trigger, I put a flood counter on Doodle's Sinkhole, letting me attack him for 3 with my divers. Bilal casts Nissa Ascended Animist, paying 4 life to reduce her cost by 2, but having her enter with 4 fewer loyalty counters. Then he activates her +1 ability to make a 4/4 Phyrexian Horror token since she has 4 loyalty counters. Jason casts an Academy Manufactor, so now whenever he would create a food, clue, or treasure, he instead creates 1 of each. Doodle plays a Swamp, attacks me with Arvad and Lauren for 7, and attacks Nissa with Teshar for 4. Before damage, Doodle activates Lauren, letting himself and Bilal draw a card. Then I block with Xolatoyac, killing Lauren, still taking 3 from Arvad, and Doodle gains 3 life since his commander has lifelink. In his second main phase, Doodle casts Tiny Bones, Bauble Burglar, returning Lauren from his graveyard to the battlefield, destroying Jason's Academy Manufactor. Or, at least he would have if Jason hadn't cast Deflecting Swat, changing the target of the ability to Doodle's own Talisman of Hierarchy, destroying that instead. Before that can resolve though, Doodle casts Doomblade, destroying the Academy Manufactor anyway. Still, before that can resolve, Jason casts Deduce, drawing a card and creating a clue token, which, since he still has the Manufactor, also makes a food and a treasure. Finally, Jason activates Bjorna, sacrificing his clue token to do 1 damage to Xolatoyac, goading it. Then everything on the stack resolves, destroying the Manufactor and Talisman. Once that resolves, Doodle sacrifices Myriad Landscape to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped, and passes. On my turn, I attack Doodle for 6 with Xolatoyac, putting a flood counter on one of Bilal's forests, and I attack Nissa for 3 with the divers, killing the Planeswalker. In my second main phase, I cast Chasm Skulker, and then after that I cast the Flood of Mars, which has Islandwalk, and whenever it attacks, puts a flood counter on target creature or land, turning lands into islands and turning creatures into copies of the Flood of Mars. On Bilal's turn, he plays a forest and recasts his commander, Nissa. Jason recasts his commander Elmar, then activates his other commander Bjorna, sacrificing a food token to do 1 damage to Arvad, goading him. After that he casts Ponder, triggering Elmar, untapping Bjorna, making a clue, and triggering Breaches, sacrificing a clue, flipping a coin, losing, and doing 1 damage to Chasm Skulker, killing it. Then the Ponder resolves, letting him look at the top 3 cards of his library, put them back in any order, and draw a card. Finally, he moves to combat and attacks me for 3 with Breaches. On Doodle's turn, he moves straight to combat, attacking me for 3 with his goaded Arvad. Then, in his second main phase, Doodle activates Tiny Bones' ability, making each opponent discard a card, exiling those cards with stash counters on them, and letting him play those cards on his turn. This ends up exiling my Spreading Seas, Bilal's Concordant Crossroads, and Jason's Game Trail. Doodle plays Jason's game trail from exile, then cast my Spreading Seas, enchanting Jason's island, turning it into an island, and more importantly letting Doodle draw a card. He then casts Giver of Runes and passes. On my turn I play a forest, and before combat, Jason activates Bjorna, sacrificing his final clue, doing 1 damage to Xolatoyac, goading it. Then I attack Doodle for 6 with my commander, putting a flood counter on one of his forests, and I attack Bilal for 3 with the divers, and attack Jason for 3 with the flood, putting a flood counter on my own Inkfathom divers, turning it into a copy of the Flood of Mars. Before damage, Doodle blocks my commander with Lauren, activating her so that he and I draw a card, then Lauren dies and Doodle takes no damage, while Bilal and Jason both take 3. In my second main phase, I cast Lurking Crocodile, which has Islandwalk and Bloodthirst 1, so it enters with a +1/+1 counter since one of my opponents lost life this turn. Finally, when I move to my end step, I untap all my permanents with counters on them. Bilal casts Llanowar Visionary, drawing a card when it enters, then plays a forest, getting 2 energy. Jason casts Tireless Tracker, letting him investigate whenever a land enters under his control, and it also gets a +1/+1 counter whenever he sacrifices a clue. After that, he casts Preordain, making a clue, scrying 2 and drawing a card. Finally, he plays an island, making another clue. Doodle plays a Plains and attacks me for 7 with Arvad and Tashar, gaining 3 life, then also attacks Jason for 3 with Tiny Bones. In his second main phase, Doodle casts and overloads a Dam, destroying all creatures. At this point, I think Jason has a counterspell in hand, so I pass priority to him, hoping he'll deal with it, but he doesn't. However, I get a second chance to respond when Doodle activates Giver of Runes, giving Arvad protection from green, and since I want to keep my board, I now counter the board wipe with Negate. Once that's resolved, Doodle casts Liesa Shroud of Dusk, letting him pay 2 life for his commander tax rather than 2 mana, and also making any player lose 2 life when they cast a spell. This triggers Teshar, letting Doodle return Lauren from his graveyard to the battlefield, destroying one of Jason's clues, but Jason sacrifices it to draw a card instead. On my turn, I move straight to combat, attacking Jason for 6 with Xolatoyac, putting a flood counter on my forest, and I attack Bilal for 3 with the Crocodile, and attack Doodle for 6 with the Floods of Mars, putting flood counters on Giver of Runes and Liesa, turning them also into copies of the Flood of Mars. In my second main phase, I cast Flow of Knowledge, drawing cards equal to the number of islands I control, which is currently 7, then discarding 2. I also play a forest and cast Cold-Eyed Selkie, which has Islandwalk and lets me draw cards equal to the combat damage it deals to an opponent. Finally, I move to my end step and untap all my permanents that have counters. Bilal plays a forest, getting 2 more energy, then casts Kozilek the Broken Reality, giving his other colorless creatures +3/+2, letting himself and Doodle manifest 2 cards from their hand, and then drawing 4 cards since 4 cards were manifested this way. Finally, Bilal attacks me for 4 with his horror token and passes. At the end of turn though, Jason activates Bjorna, sacrificing a clue to do 1 damage to Kozilek, goading it. On Jason's turn, he plays an island, investigating, then attacks me for 3 with breaches, and passes. Doodle moves straight to combat, attacking me for 12 with Arvad, Teshar, a Manifest, and Tiny Bones. He also attacks Jason for 4 with Lauren, and attacks Bilal for 6 with the 2 Floods of Mars, putting a flood counter on Elmar and Kozilek, turning them into additional copies of the Flood of Mars. Then, Jason blocks Lauren with his flood, and I block both Arvad and the Manifest with my flood and a Crocodile. Before damage, Doodle flips up his attacking Manifest, revealing Elish Norn Grand Cenobite, now giving his creatures +2/+2 and his opponent's creatures -2/-2. This automatically kills my Selkie, Bilal's Manifests, Birds of Paradise, and Elvish Visionary. Then damage happens with all blocking creatures dying, while Jason takes no damage, Bilal takes 10, I take 11, and Doodle gains 5. Notably, since one of Bilal's manifest was a Blightsteel Colossus, it gets shuffled back into his library when it's put into the graveyard. At the end of turn, Jason casts and overloads Cyclonic Rift, returning all non-land permanents his opponents control to their owner's hand. In response, Doodle activates Lauren, letting himself and I each draw a card. On my turn, I play a forest and cast Stormtide Leviathan, which has Islandwalk, turns all lands into islands in addition to their other types, and prevents creatures without flying or Islandwalk from attacking. Then I recast Spreading Seas, again enchanting Jason's island, turning it into an island and drawing a card. Bilal recasts his commander Nissa, plays a forest, getting 2 energy, and letting him pay 8 energy to cast Emrakul the World anew, gaining control of all creatures I control, but when Emrakul leaves the battlefield, he's forced to sacrifice all creatures he controls. In response, Jason activates Bjorna, sacrificing a clue to do 1 damage to the Leviathan, goading it. Finally, Bilal casts Beast Whisperer, drawing a card when he casts a creature spell. Jason casts Adrix and Neb Twin Casters, doubling the number of tokens he would create. Doodle recast Teshar and his commander Arvad, once again giving all his other legendary creatures +2/+2, and letting him return Lauren from his graveyard to the battlefield, destroying Spreading Seas. On my turn, I play a forest and cast Flow of Ideas, drawing a card for each island I control, which is currently 11 thanks to the Leviathan. After that, I cast Carpet of Flowers, letting me make X mana at the beginning of each of my main phases, as long as I haven't already made mana with it this turn, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. This lets me pass through combat and make 9 mana in my second main phase, because Doodle controls 9 islands. With that, I can cast Floodgate, dealing damage to each non-blue creature without flying equal to half the number of islands I control when it leaves the battlefield, and I also recast the Flood of Mars. Bilal plays a forest, getting 2 energy, casts Shamanic Revelation, drawing 4 cards since he controls 4 creatures, and gains 4 life for each of those creatures that has 4 or more power, meaning he gains a total of 8 life. After that, he casts a Findhorn Elves, drawing a card, and attacks Doodle for 20 with Emrakul and the Leviathan, but Doodle blocks Emrakul with Teshar, killing the blocker so he only takes 8 damage. Jason casts a Tireless Provisioner, now making a food or treasure token whenever a land enters under his control. This lets him play Karplusan Forest to make 2 treasures and 2 clues. Doodle recasts Tiny Bones, which lets him cast Bilal's Concordant Crossroads from exile, giving all creatures haste. After that, he casts Search for Glory, searching his library for Mangara of Corondor, putting it into his hand and gaining 3 life since he used 3 snow mana to cast it. This means that he can cast Mangara immediately, then at the end of turn, I cast Harrow, sacrificing a land to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play. Then, in my upkeep, Doodle is able to activate Mangara, exiling both itself and Emrakul. Once Emrakul leaves Bilal's board, he's then forced to sacrifice the rest of his creatures, meaning that now when I move to my first main phase, I only make 2 mana with Carpet of Flowers. This does, though, still let me recast my commander Xolatoyac, putting a flood counter on one of my forests when it enters, and also cast Enclave Elite, kicking it 4 times so it enters with 4 +1/+1 counters, and it also has Islandwalk. Before I can move to combat, Jason activates Bjorna, sacrificing a clue to do 1 damage to the Flood of Mars, goading it. Then I attack Doodle for 3 with the Flood of Mars, putting a flood counter on Bjorna, turning it into a copy of the Flood. I attack Bilal for 6 with Xolatoyac, putting another flood counter on one of my forests, and I attack Jason for 6 with the Elite. Finally, at the end of turn, I untap all my permanents with counters. Bilal plays a forest and casts Patron of the Orochi, immediately tapping it to untap all forests and green creatures. Notably, this should also untap all of his opponent's forests and green creatures as well, but we don't catch that at the time. After that, Bilal recast Xolatoyac, letting him and I both manifest 2 cards from our hands, and he draws 4. At the end of turn, Jason sacrifices a clue to draw a card and put a counter on Tireless Tracker, and still at the end of turn, Jason also casts Opt, scrying 1 and drawing a card. On his turn, Jason casts Unexpected Windfall, discarding a card, drawing 2 and making 4 treasures. He then attacks Bilal for 3 with the Flood of Mars, putting a flood counter on Xolatoyac, so it also becomes a Flood of Mars. Then in his second main phase, he casts Growth Spiral, drawing a card and putting Frontier Bivouac into play, triggering breaches, sacrificing a clue, flipping a coin, winning, copying the spell, drawing another card, and putting a forest into play. Both lands also trigger the tracker and provisioner, so he makes 4 more treasures and 4 more clues. At the end of turn, Doodle activates Lauren, letting him and I both draw a card. On Doodle's turn, he plays a Caves of Koilos and casts Audric Lunarch Marshal, giving his creatures all keywords that any of his creatures have at the beginning of each combat, currently including Death Touch, Lifelink, and Vigilance. Then he recasts Liesa, Shroud of Dusk, adding flying to the keywords among his creatures. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 7, but before he can do damage, I cast Engulf the Shore, losing 2 life, returning all creatures with toughness 9 or less to their owner's hands, since I control 9 islands, and to try to find an answer, Jason responds, sacrificing 3 clues to draw 3 cards and put 3 counters on Tireless Tracker, but he's unable to find a way to stop it, so the board wipe resolves. Finally, at the end of turn, I cast Entish Restoration, sacrificing a forest to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. At the beginning of my first main phase, I make 2 mana with Carpet of Flowers, allowing me to recast my commander Xolatoyac, putting a flood counter on another one of my forests. Then I also cast Harbinger of the Seas, turning all non-basic lands into islands. After that, I recast the Flood of Mars, and also cast the Sea Devils, making a 2/2 alien salamander creature token with Islandwalk. Before I move to combat though, Jason cast Chaos Warp, shuffling my Harbinger into my library and letting me reveal the top card of my library, putting it into play if it's a permanent. However, since the Arcane Denial that I reveal is an instant, it stays on top. Once that is resolved, I attack Doodle with the Flood of Mars, putting the Flood counter on my Salamander, turning it into a copy of the Flood. Then I also attack Doodle with the former Salamander, hitting him for 6 total damage. Finally, at the end of turn, I untap all my permanents that have counters. Bilal plays a forest and casts Nissa Who Shakes the World, letting his forest tap for an additional mana. He immediately activates her +1 ability to untap one of his forests, put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and turn it into a 0/0 elemental with Vigilance and Haste. This lets him recast Patron of the Orochi and also cast Regal Behemoth, becoming the Monarch and letting his lands tap for yet another additional mana as long as he remains the Monarch. After that, he activates the Patron, untapping all forests and green creatures. This lets him cast Ancient Bronze Dragon, recast Xolatoyac, letting himself manifest 2 cards from his hand and drawing 2 cards. Once that's resolved, he also cast Emrakul the Promised End, taking control of Doodle's next turn, but giving him an extra turn after that. Once that has resolved, he casts Aetherworks Marvel and also evokes an Endurance, shuffling his own graveyard back into his library and sacrificing the elemental after it enters, giving him an energy with Aetherworks Marvel. This gives him exactly 6 energy, so he can activate the Marvel, looking at the top 6 cards of his library and casting a spell from among them for free, choosing to cast Nyx Bloom Ancient, now tripling the mana his lands would produce, and for those counting, that means that each of his forests now tap for 9 mana. Finally, Bilal moves to combat, attacking me for 7 with his dragon, attacking Jason for 23 with Emrakul and the Patron, and attacking Doodle with everything else for 29, knocking us all out and winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely got to show off what our deck could do. I think everyone's deck kind of got the chance to showcase itself, which is normally one of my favorite styles of games, so I'm glad that we got to see that this week. But let's talk a little bit about each person's deck, see how they did, and kind of get some comments on that. So, starting with ours, I really do think our deck performed very well. I was very impressed by the Flood of Mars, and I know I talked it up earlier in the keycard section, but wow, that card put in so much work this game. It was constantly hitting the board, constantly swinging, turning things off that were massive threats like Xolatoyac or Bjorna and things like that, and it just really felt like a solid removal spell while also acting as a constant pressure on our opponents. So I was very impressed with that. Very impressed with Xolatoyac being able to untap our lands and untap our permanents. It really just felt like a much more cohesive deck than I thought it was going to be going into this. I didn't think Islandwalk Matters was going to be a powerful deck, but I was genuinely very impressed and very happy with how it turned out and how it performed. Moving around the table, let's go counterclockwise so we can end with our winner. We had Doodle and his Arvad deck, which really put in a ton of work, and I think the main reason it did so much was probably because of Teshar. I think that without Teshar, he might have struggled a little bit to keep creatures on the board, but being able to reanimate something every single time he cast a spell meant that he could keep getting Lauren back, he could keep getting Tiny Bones back, things like that, and just kind of keep the value train going, and then be able to gain some life and do some damage and remove some permanents. It really just felt like a well-oiled machine, and while he never quite was able to do a ton of damage, he still played a significant role in the game, and I think that that is usually all you can ask for when you're playing a game of Commander. Moving around the table still, we get to Jason and his Bjorna and Elmar deck. Also very impressive the way that it performed. I don't usually see a ton of the artifact synergies in green and red and blue in the way that he showed them off in this. Being able to make the clue tokens and treasure tokens meant that he could play cards like Unexpected Windfall, get a ton of tokens, but he could also play things like Adrix and Nev to double up on his tokens. So I think it was a super cool build, and it didn't seem like he was doing a ton of damage as the game went on, but watching the game back, he definitely did more damage by being able to goad his opponents' things and kind of use them as a weapon to take out his other opponents. So while he didn't attack that often, he was able to force other people to attack and almost do his dirty work for him, which is a very cool gameplay strategy. Finally, though, last but not least, we get to our winner of the game, Bilal, who we kind of joked about him winning the game as the game progressed because he really got set back early on. He missed a bunch of land drops. He had all of his mana dorks board wiped. And so he really struggled early game, and a lot of us kind of started to ignore him until eventually he did what mono green does and ramped, got some massive creatures, got some Eldrazi in play. And that final turn where he just kind of dumped his entire hand, he's making 33 some odd mana, being able to put in multiple Eldrazi's, and then win with a Concordant Crossroads, giving them haste, which he didn't even have the Concordant Crossroads. Doodle had cast and after stealing Bilal's Concordant Crossroads. So very impressive, definitely a mono green style of victory. And one of the things that I think goes underrated about this Nissa is the fact that she still interacts well with a lot of energy synergies. There's been a lot of pushes to get energy into a lot of different colors lately, and green has benefited from that because a lot of them are focused on things like landfall or permanents leaving the battlefield, things that green is typically very good at no matter what. So I was very happy with this game. I had a ton of fun. It took so long to get through. It was like a 2-hour game, but still a ton of fun. So let me know down in the comments if there's any cards you would like to see built around in the future. I love getting suggestions. I love building decks. That's why I do this. But Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. That helps out so much. But thank you all so much, and I will see you on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.